when I saw the first ghost echoes thicken on the SK scope like moths at the edge of a lantern over the Philippine Sea. He would later say that the map of the Marianas on his knee lit up with a heat you could feel through paper. Lieutenant J.G. Aaron Hale, United States Navy, Fighter Direction Officer in the Combat Information Center of USS Lexington, CV-16. Task Group 583, 5th Fleet, looked into the dim pool of green light and watched the Japanese mobile fleet turn from rumor into return. The date was June 19, 1944, the day the Battle of the Philippine Sea opened its clenched hand and showed what it had been carrying since Operation Forager, had put Marines ashore on Saipan and Tinian and the Army's XXIV Corps pointed at Guam. The coordinates were somewhere east of the Marianas, an ocean grid that the flag plot of Task Force 58 had made into an organ with nerves and breath. In the Lexington's belly, the Combat Information Center breathed the heat of men in tubes and the familiar smell ozone, coffee, sweat, cordite carried on someone's sleeve while the SK Air Search Radar wrote the distance in miles between their air cover and Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa's first mobile fleet, a script of range rings and moving spots, bearings in degrees true, 270, 263, 255. He had learned to love these numbers like family names. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher was a continent in motion. 4 carrier task groups TG-581, TG-582, TG-583, TG-584 each with its own big-deck Essex-class carriers and light carriers, fast battleships, cruisers, destroyers. USS Lexington, CV-16, sat at the heart of TG-583 with USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Princeton, CVL-23, and USS San Jacinto, CVL-30. Heavy cruisers USS Indianapolis, CA-35, and USS Minneapolis, CA-36. Light cruisers USS Houston, CL-81, and USS Santa Fe, L-60. Battleships USS Washington, BB-56, and USS North Carolina, BB-55, were nearby with their SK and SC-2Is and 5-inch/38 dual-purpose throats. Destroyers in a Ring Fletcher-class names like USS Heermann, DD-532, did not belong to their group this time, but names like USS Hale, DD-556, USS Owen, DD-536, USS Spence, DD-512, lived on their voice circuits picketed the horizon with SG surface search radar and SC-2 air search humming quietly, all of it subordinate to the cause of keeping the Marines inland on Saipan and Tinian and the transports in Saipan Channel unmolested by a counterstroke. In that inner space CIC he stood with sleeves rolled to elbows, headphones warmed by his head, grease pencil clutched against the edge of a vertical plot board where the PPI scope's sweep bloomed phantom white at the edge of green. The fighter direction officer worked where air and sea become math. SK radar gave him the long look at 200-mile horizon of moving dots, and SC2 and SM added height and angle when they could. SG told him if surface contacts lurked beneath. The YEZB homing beacons pulsed in the wild calm of radio frequency to call flyers home. The CXM legacy had become SK and SM. Better eyes still knew enough to feel like magic. He added voice to this call signs on the TBS net, voice commands to the Fleet Air Defense net, standard brevity that had become vernacular, bogies bearing 265, Angels 15, Vector 270, Buster. He carried topography in his head. Saipan's Mount Tapasho like a fist, Tinian's flatness after quarrying, Rhoda's ridged spine, Guam's Orote Peninsula because the air above these islands was the stage on which F-6F Hellcats would mete out distances with guns. He had begun in another navy, the navy of reading about Tsushima, Dogger Bank, Jutland, and the habit of steel. He had come here through radar school with a pencil tucked behind his ear and a disdain for sleep, shipped to USS Lexington after she joined the Essex-class parade that had become the spine of the 5th Fleet. Lexington's Air Group 16 under Commander William R. Killer Kane brought with it the F-6F Hellcat of VF-16, the SB-2C Helldiver of VB-16, the TBM Avenger of VT-16. He had learned the names the way men memorize faces because they will need to call them from far away. VF-16 section leaders, whose voices would become as much a part of his day as steam and coffee. Call signs like Lexington Control on the Fighter Director channel. Abbreviations that would be his tongue: CAP for Combat Air Patrol, VF for Fighter Squadron, Angels for altitude in thousands of feet, Bogey for unknown, Bandit for confirmed enemy, Buster for full power, Paddles for LSO on the Stern. At dawn on June 19, the Philippine Sea had been a quilt of steel under the Big Invisible, carriers into wind at 25 knots, Task Force 58 covering the invasion beaches of Saipan and Tinian, the transports and LSTs in the lee of Saipan's long reef like children under a roof, the 5th Fleet Commander, Raymond A. Spruance, in heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, weighing the risk of charging west to meet Ozawa at the edge of his fuel versus holding his carriers east to guard the amphibious landing. Operation Forager was the spine of it. The 5th Fleet's 2 pillars, Spruance with the plan, Mitcher with the execution, agreed on the priority. The Marines and soldiers under fire ashore. The Japanese had named their counterstroke Operation Ego. Ozawa's first mobile fleet had slipped up through the San Bernardino and San Miguel Straits into a sea remembered by names: the Mariana Islands, the Philippine Sea. His carriers flagship Taiho, fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuho, supplemented by the hybrid battleship carriers ISE and Hyuga at a distance, came with air groups that wore old names: S6M50 fighters, D4Y Judy dive bombers, B6N Jill torpedo bombers, reinforced by land-based air from Guam, Rota, and Yap. They carried pilots blooded after the Central Pacific had soaked them and younger men to replace the dead. Too few hours in type. Doctrine deluded, hope stubborn. The first scope echo arrived as a quiver on the SK at 0900. HMS or USS or IJN meant nothing to radar. Echoes were echoes. Lexington's SK indicated a group of blips blooming at 190 miles west by southwest. Bearing 265 true. Angels indeterminate until SM could scratch it for them. The voice of the air search evaluator, the aged petty officer who had seen enough to keep his voice dry, called it to fighter direction. Aaron took it in, rolled his pencil once in his finger's habit, and said to the voice on the FAD net in the tone the Hellcats recognized as Lexington's control: Lexington to CP11. Bogey dope. Bogeys 265 true, 180 miles. Angels 15. Vector 270. Buster. VF-16's lead element, the 4-plane division anchored by Lieutenant Commander Paul Drayton. Call sign in his head as a solid square answered with the calm that had become the sky's grammar. The F-6F Hellcat made a particular sound in the Lexington's overhead when it left with a full belly of 50 caliber, 6 Browning M2S, 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds of argument. The CAP had been stacked. Sections at Angels 20, 15, and 10, circles offset. More sections climbing from the deck because every TBS line had woken to that SK scope's thickening signature. He gave vector after vector, each like a finger touching the arc on a plotting board that showed rings at 50, 100, 150, 200 miles. The Hellcats were specks beyond the bow, then gone. He put new chalk lines on the vertical board and listened to the rest of Task Force 58 respond. Other fighter directors in TG-582 and TG-584 on USS Wasp, CV-18, USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, USS Essex, CV-9, and USS Langley, CVL-27, ran their own CAP nets, voices collected by Spruance's flagstaff as the 5th Fleet turned itself into a comb that the Japanese would have to run through teeth first. The first raid came in 4 stacks like the textbook said it would when a mobile fleet's 2 nearer carriers Chitose and Chiyoda with Zuiko launched. Except this was not a textbook, and the Mitsubishi A6M0 escorts had been tasked to ride at an altitude the Hellcats liked to hunt in. Reports from Guam, a radar station on Orote, had had its mouth shut by marine bombardment but made itself heard twice, once weak laced into the net. TG-581's fighters from USS Hornet, CV-12, and USS Yorktown, CV-10, had already turned into a swarm. Hellcats of VF-2, VF-15, VF-27 climbed in from those decks like blue bees at a hurt orchard. The direction center on USS Enterprise fed vectors to VF-10's Grim Reapers. Lexington's VF-16 took the first cut at their own slice. When the F-6FS noses were pointed right, the radar beeps turned from generic bogey to bandit. D4Y Judy dive bombers with their fast roll and sleek wings. B6N Jill torpedo bombers with a slower carriage and a habit of riding lower than was wise under modern rules. A 6M50s that looked like something his brother would have built for a shelf at home and flew like the ghosts of a doctrine that had bitten at Wake and in the Coral Sea and now bled at Saipan's edge. He spoke vectors while other men bled. The voice discipline of the fighter net saved them. Vector 270. Angels 16. Bogies now 252 true 150 miles, the Hellcats rode radar until they rode eyeballs. The first merges sounded like a bar fight, calm voice stripped of grammar. Lexington Control, VF-16 Tear 1. Tally. Bandits North. Engaging. Angels 15250. He knew the names behind the voices because he had forced himself to memorize them for nights Hoffman, Armstrong, Delaney, Kelso. So when they said, Splash 1 Jill, it had the correct weight. He wrote Splash beside a small black triangle on his plot and made himself human again long enough to mark it. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot later because men love to make a joke when numbers are too large to carry without cracking. For all the cruel ease in the phrase turkey shoot, there was nothing easy about the work. The A6M50's turn at low speed could still break a less experienced Hellcat pilot's neck if he tried to play the zeros game. The D4Y Judy's dive had speed in it that made the first stick shoot a matter of breath and prayer. The B6N Jill's torpedo, the Type 91 aerial torpedo installed under a belly that remembered its father's shape, was a long gray argument with fate that would not end in favor of an American carrier if the Jill got to 700 meters off a beam with speed still in its belly. But F-6F Hellcats flown by VF-16 from USS Lexington and VF-10 from USS Enterprise and VF-27 from USS Princeton and VF-51 from USS San Jacinto had the climb, the roll, the altitude, the speed, and on this day above the Philippine Sea the radar to put them in the right place first. He kept the plot moving. Bogey groups at 180 miles became at 140, then 100, then 75, then 50. One group fell apart at 72 under the combined fire of VF-16 and VF-10. A 6MS unwinding from their escort's high flights into smoke lines. D4YS throwing their bombs into warm blue aimlessly because Hellcats had found them before the pushover. Another group, the Jills, broke left and down to try to ride under the CAP at Angels 5. Aaron reached for VF-16's lowest section. They had been living at Angels 8 for 2 hours, conserving fuel with an efficiency that was as much virtue as discipline. He said, Vector 300, Angels 8, Buster. Bandits at Angels 5-inch, you could hear the engine levers in the Hellcats being pushed forward in the static. And then you could see the finality on the radar. The V-shaped wedge of 7 return dots became 4, then 2, then none. The ocean below them made a moving graveyard. The 5th Fleet's Pickett's destroyers patrolling the CAP station line wrote the last line of mercy when they had time, pulling pilots and green-dyed Mae Wests from water alive with fuel rainbows. By noon, Task Group 583 had seen 4 raids broken. Hellcats from USS Lexington, USS Enterprise, USS Princeton, and USS San Jacinto had splashed B6NS and D4YS and A6MS in numbers that made history's counters tap their pens. VF-16 added tallies to chalk. Lexington's Fighter Direction Center wrote the numbers with reluctance because men do not like to make singing of death VF-16 claims. 5 Jills, 7 Judas, 9 zeros, but the net recorded what it recorded. The SK reported new blips forming beyond 200 miles. Then vanishing as if the sea had swallowed seeds. Ozawa's mobile fleet had flung a day's training into a grinder where radar and geometry and the F-6F Hellcat forced old tactics to pay in full. He had time to drink coffee that tasted like a burned house and wipe his glasses on a sleeve before the voice from below came up through the ship's wire exhalations, the voice from the flag level. He carried the 5th Fleet's choices. Spruance had held his carriers east of the Marianas to cover Operation Forager's invasion of Saipan and Tinian. He would continue to hold them, letting Task Force 58 function as giant AA picket for the amphibious force. Aaron respected this choice because he could see on the secondary scopes the fat cluster of blips that meant amphibious hulks and landing ships, LSTs, Liberty ships, LSDs parented by escort carriers from Task Group 52, under attack from land-based air from Guam and Rota. The 5th Fleet's job was not just to kill Ozawa's flyers, but to prevent the enemy from touching those beaches. Every vector he sent kept lives ashore under the name of Saipan Marine Divisions more secure. He learned of the submarine's successes like gossip carried up a stairwell. USS Albacore SS-218 had found Taiho the pride of the first mobile fleet, new armored deck carrier, flagship of Vice Admiral Ozawa, and put a Mark 14 into the belly of a doctrine. The explosion had not killed Taiho outright. The news came in a rumor at first. Taiho damaged, but underway later, after the first day closed, the news would harden. Gasoline fumes poorly vented had met a spark in Taiho's guts and turned flagship into void. Around the same hour, USS Kavala SS-244 found Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and did what the American submarine force had wanted to do since 1942. Put 3 torpedoes into Shokaku's side and let the flight deck that had launched this war fold into herself, fires meeting magazines in a logic that makes its own geometry. Aaron heard the words on the radar plot deck as if they were said to a neighbor. Shokaku sunk, and he let the idea turn in his head while his hands still drew vectors. The big carriers of Ozawa's mobile fleet Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku had believed themselves safe under doctrine. A single Mark 14 from USS Albacore had opened a door in Taiho through which the sea would walk all afternoon, while the Japanese damage control crews learned oxygen is as dangerous as salt. In the afternoon, the CAP rested in relays and then ran out again. The F-6FS from USS Lexington landed. Fuel state down to fumes, some leaning on a wing where 30 caliber holes had made the rubber feel too thin. Taxiing behind the barricades while the TBM Avengers loaded in their quiet way Mark 13 aerial torpedoes or 500-pounders, whichever weight the next paragraph demanded, and the SB-2C Helldivers cursed their beasts' teething problems and still strapped in for the later writing. Lexington's flight deck crew worked in a cadence that gave the lie to the word chaos. The LSO, paddles in hand, brought fighters in with the familiar circles and slashes of a man who hears Angels 5 low fuel in his sleep. His name was a thing Aaron had not liked at first because it was a vaudeville name, Paddles O'Rourke, and had turned out to belong to a man who could read a crosswind the way men read a friend's voice. For Hellcats from VF-16 jerked onto the deck, hooks finding steel, engines howling and then meek, first stage flaps down, range is safe, pilots shaking their hands while taxiing as if to flick off the numbness in their fingers. In his earset, a new section from VF-16 checked in. He gave them angels and a vector and they left, for blue ellipses gathering altitude. On the amphibious net there was other noise. Saipan's beaches, red beach at Charn Kanoa, blue beach, green beach wore the noise of men making a home in hell. Marines dug into coral dust and poured water onto themselves and tried to sleep in the presence of shells. The Fifth Fleet's heavy ships had been firing inland all morning. Battleships like USS Tennessee, BB-43, USS California, BB-44, and USS Maryland, BB-46, pumping 14-inch and 16-inch into ridges where honeycomb Japanese positions held on while fast carriers of Task Force 58 batted away Ozawa's flyers. The words Operation Forager kept their weight under all this. There were gear lists that had to be kept moving, ammunition dumps that had to be carried. Lexington's Combat Information Center was both far from and intimate with those beaches, as if someone had dug a tunnel from the CIC into the Marines' foxholes and only allowed voices to pass. Aaron spoke to the sky and thought of the sand. By late afternoon on June 19, 1944, the numbers began to crystallize. Task Force 58's Hellcats and Flak had killed so many of the first mobile fleet's airborne that the ocean should have changed color. The SK had watched wave upon wave break. The fighter directors of TG-581, TG-582, TG-584 Yorktown, Hornet, Essex, Wasp, Bunker Hill, and the light carriers had kept their nets simple, and the nets had been full of the same sentence in different voices. Tally-ho, many bandits, splashes. The phrase began to smell like cordite. Aaron wrote the words Marianas turkey shoot once in pencil in the corner of his log by accident when the voice next to him muttered it aloud. He erased it at once because he did not want to make a game of this while holding someone's vector in his teeth. But the phrase hung in the air because someone in VF-15 had said it with a laugh that sounded like a cough, and the rumor took root. Night came to the Philippine Sea like a sheet pulled over a sleeping thing still on fire. Spruance held his carriers east. Mitcher turned Task Force 58 into a defensive circle heavy with pickets. The destroyers fanned, their SG beams painting the sea. The YEZB homing beacons sang their reply to fighters still catching the ladder down out of the sky, and the LSO lines stayed open. Aaron removed his headphones and put them around his neck and listened to the air for a minute as if it were an old radio he had owned as a boy. The watch needed to be passed. He did not want to pass it because leaving the room felt like stepping out of the giant's eye into blindness. He went anyway. The mess smelled like food, which felt like an insult, and the coffee tasted like hope, which felt like a bigger insult, and he drank both because the body is unpatriotic and asks for things. On June 20th, the Battle of the Philippine Sea shifted its scenery. Orote Field on Guam had been pounded into rocks by Fletcher-class destroyers, cruisers, battleships. The cruiser Santa Fe and Mobile and the battleship New Mexico had their own powder stories to tell, and yet land-based planes still crawled like insects from field and cove, supported by Tinian and Rota. Ozawa's first mobile fleet, robbed of Taiho and Shokaku, still had Zuikaku and 3 light carriers, still had the will to hold out and keep distance to accommodate fuel. Fifth Fleet plotted the mobile fleet to the west more than 300 miles if the SK lines told true. Mitcher asked for and received Spruance's blessing for a blow that would be remembered later by a phrase that had the shape of an order and a half-prayer: Mission Beyond Darkness. He read the order with VF-16's leader by the plotting board like a priest sharing the day's liturgy. Task Force 58 would launch a late afternoon strike at extreme range between 200 and 300 miles to catch Ozawa's mobile fleet at the edge of sight, then bring those aircraft home in the dark, risking the return in the black bowl of the Philippine Sea. The old men of the Navy would have called it folly. The new men called it the best chance they would get. Lexington's planes were fueled. TBM Avengers were hung with Mark 13s, Helldivers with 500-pound GP bombs, Hellcats with 20mm ammo and 50 caliber topped off for fighter sweep and strafing. TF-58's other decks did the same. VF-1, VB-2, VT-2 from USS Hornet, VF-4, VB-4, VT-4 from USS Yorktown, VF-8, VB-8, VT-8 from USS Bunker Hill, VF-14, VB-14, VT-14 from USS Wasp, VF-15, VB-15, VT-15 from USS Essex, VF-27 and their mates from USS Princeton and USS San Jacinto, VF-10 from USS Enterprise, Air Group 10 with their skull and crossbones history, all the letters that would become ink in a book. The launch sequence on USS Lexington felt like a muscle memory of a body with too much adrenaline. The wind was measured and grabbed 25 knots across the deck, carriers turning into it under Mitcher's hand. The FDO was in CIC again for the launch because the fighter director rides all of it, not only the intercepts. The voice of the air plot kept the timing curled under his tongue like a hard candy. Launch in sequence, all strikes, 1600 local. The deck crews danced the old steps. Chocks, taxi, signal, run. The F-6F Hellcats of VF-16 rose first in 4 plane elements, their blue paint dull under the late sun. The SB-2C Helldivers of VB-16 followed, their wings folded down like the arms of an impatient man, dive brakes red and neat as a mouth held shut until it was time. The TBM Avengers, heavy with Mark 13 torpedoes now improved by anti-ricochet noses and wooden tail shrouds, lumbered into air with the stubborn grace of a workhorse promised sugar later. Lexington shot them off, then watched Enterprise and Princeton and San Jacinto do the same. Over by TG-584, USS Essex and USS Langley threw their own squadrons. TG-582's USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill did the same. TG-581's Hornet and Yorktown filled the sky. It looked like the entire Fifth Fleet had learned to fly. Aaron's job now was a mixture of distance and mercy. The outbound strike rode High Angels 6, 8, 10 preserving fuel, leaning on their YEZB homers and the vector of the lead. Hellcats cleared the decks around them, fanned out ahead to sweep any zero that might reach out. The SK's scope followed them until they were gone into distance. Then it found something else, a thin cluster of returns at the edge of the long arc. He did the math almost without thinking, the way men in his village can throw a bale onto a wagon without measuring it. 215 miles, then 230. He whispered the difference between knots and miles per hour like a prayer. He let the enemy group be real without giving it a face. He had been a fighter director long enough to know that seeing faces is a hobby that keeps you from doing math. Somewhere to the west, the strike from TF-58 met the fragments of Ozawa's air cover like swallows hitting a storm. Hellcats from VF-16 and VF-10 cut zeros down like things that are not quite part of the same century anymore. Out of the haze rose shapes too big to be anything else. Zuikaku's flight deck, clean lines beneath the slant of a stack that any modeler could tell in silhouette, Junyo and Hyo, and the light carriers Chitose and Chiyoda and Zuho somewhere forward or aft. The strikes from USS Essex and USS Yorktown and USS Hornet and USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill fell on Ozawa's mobile fleet with a variety of skill and luck organized by distance and fatigue. One strike from USS Bunker Hill found Hyo and hurt her. The blend of 500-pounders and Mark 13 torpedoes showed how doctrine falls into the hands of physics. Hyo took torpedoes and fire slouched across a deck that remembered its building as something else. She would die of those fires, which is to say of gasoline vapors. The other carriers took hits or near misses, twisted steel and torn vents, splinters like swords. Aaron learned the shapes later in debrief, but in the moment he heard only, Raider 1 reports carrier hit. Hyo burning. He wrote it around the edge of the plot because superstition said writing in the center would jinx a man's return. Calling the strike home was a different kind of war. The afternoon leaned toward night. The western horizon was a rim of blood, then a rim of steel, then nothing. The Fifth Fleet's calm became a question. Mitcher faced the decision that would become legend. Order all ships of Task Force 58 to turn on their lights in a sea where Japanese submarines had lived free for months? The order slipped from flag deck down to CIC and then down to the galleys because illumination runs from captain to cook. Aaron held the TBS handset and heard the words spoken as if they were being said into a church. Turn on the lights, it went out in other words too. Illuminate the flight deck's searchlights on YZB full power in the black bowl of the Philippine Sea. The carriers of Task Force 58 Lexington, Enterprise, Princeton, San Jacinto, Hornet, Yorktown, Wasp, Bunker Hill, Essex, Langley, Cowpens, Bellowwood, Cabot. Monterey lit their decks like cities. A decision that said we are here and we want our children home more than we fear the enemy's torpedoes. The fighter direction net changed its music. Instead of bogey dope, it became homing Hellcats SB-2CS. TBMs came home from the far west like moths blown thin. Lost groups calling out fuel states. Numbers too low to be numbers, low, voices thin from oxygen and nerves, and the fact that flying at night in a Pacific war is like writing your name with your teeth. The YE beacons pulsed. The ZB receivers in the cockpits listened. The LSO's paddles wove circles in air. The British cruiser HMS Sheffield would have called it a fairyland if she had been present. This was American. Aaron vectored a string of VF-16 down the ladder. He had the slow heart gift of hearing a man's breath and knowing whether he had 3 minutes or 7 or 0. He tried not to count. He saw strange things. A helldiver, misreading the homing signal, lined up on the wrong flat top and slotted in. A destroyer took down a string of fighters like a mother in the middle of a flood, men landing on a tin strip of deck with no wires, leaping the side as soon as their wheels kissed the salt-wet surface. The destroyer's crew grabbing and hauling with a speed that came from repeated practice. USS Lexington turned her YE antenna toward one quadrant and then another like a father with a lantern. USS Enterprise lived up to her legend, paddles catching the faint motor sound with a born hunter's ear. USS San Jacinto's lights glowed steady as a house in a region with no electricity. The battleship ring held their light on the superstructure and their guns oriented to blackness, South Dakota and Indiana and Washington pointing turreted eyes at nothing just in case nothing blinked. The destroyers stayed close, one hand on throttle, one on depth charges, one on the rope for the next aviator. Men fell into the sea that night. Some were not found. Some were found by destroyers of TG-583. Some by TG-581 or TG-582 or TG-584. Some by luck and some by a compass. Aaron carried their names like IOUs. A Hellcat pilot who had called turning base now spoke no more. A TBM crew that had said, lights in sight, low fuel, did not arrive. The Hellcat that declared ZB on the nose, low on gas, flopped onto the wrong deck and did not feel the difference. The fighters with belly tanks had been told to jettison them before landing. A man forgot and exploded in lights because forgetfulness sometimes kills. Aaron took all of that into his ears and did his arithmetic. The differences between past and present are sometimes simply that he had a pencil and an eraser and could mark a line and erase it and then draw it again. In the morning, the Fifth Fleet counted itself and found itself nearly whole. Task Force 58 had returned most of its striking arm. The cost in aircraft lost to the night was not light, but the weight of what had been bought made men repeat the numbers at breakfast like a grace. Ozawa's first mobile fleet had lost Taiho to gasoline and Shokaku to Cavala's fish and Hyo to fire. The Japanese air groups had been slaughtered over the Philippine Sea in numbers that would have been unimaginable at Coral Sea or Midway. This would be remembered as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The ruin to naval air power on the Japanese side could be expressed as a list men like Aaron hated and loved because lists make the past carry handles. 300-plus planes gone, pilots gone, numbers beyond repair. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had irrevocably broken the Japanese mobile fleet's ability to throw offensive air against Task Force 58. Saipan would be held and Tinian taken and Guam taken back. B-29s would roll into West Field and North Field and Isley Field and flight plan the rest of the war. Fighters marched across the Lexington's deck that morning as if nothing had happened because a carrier's deck does not know decency. VF-16's Hellcats lined in a row with their engine cowlings off, men with tools in mouths, cleaning the guts. VB-16's Helldivers were being refueled from lines that made the smell of raw gas into new memory. VT-16's Avengers had their torpedo shackles examined as if a handshake had to be practiced again and again. The LSO's paddles leaned against the island. In the Combat Information Center, the SK kept sweeping because men who stop sweeping after a fight die later for a smaller reason. The plot board still bore the grease scars of last night's circles and arrows, and Aaron did not want the planes to go again that day but knew they would if asked, because Task Force 58 moved as one animal under Spruance and Mitcher. He had time to think then. He had time to say the names in his head because memory cannot keep peace without names. Task Force 58, 5th Fleet, Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, Task Group 583, USS Lexington, CV-16, USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Princeton, CVL-23, USS San Jacinto, CVL-30, VF-16, VB-16, VT-16, F-6F Hellcat, SB-2C Helldiver, TBM Avenger, SK Radar, SC-2, SM Height Finder, SG Surface Search, YEZB Homing, Fighter Direction Officer, Combat Information Center. He said the other side's names to keep time fair. First Mobile Fleet, Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa, Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuho, Hyo, Junyo, S6M50, D4Y Judy, B6N Jill, Operation Ego, Guam, Rota, Saipan. He added the names of submarines because the sea had written its own chapter under the water, USS Albacore, USS Cavala. He said Mission Beyond Darkness, and felt his chest become a map. He let his mind back to June 19th and traced the arcs again. Not because he wanted to relive the kill, but because he wanted to understand exactness. The first Japanese raid from Ozawa's mobile fleet had come on a bearing 265 true at almost 200 miles radar's long look, then more from 250, 240. The fighters from TG-582 and TG-584 had eaten their share. The wave against the amphibious group in Saipan Channel had been a separate geometry, handled by the CVEs of Task Group 52 with their FM-2 Wildcats and even TBMs loaded with depth charges and general-purpose bombs that could be made into airbursts above Coral. He had not been there to vector them, but he had seen the blips and his hands had itched to help. The Division of Labor had held. Fifth Fleet had kept carriers east. The amphibious support groups had done the ugly, slow work. The submarines had sat west on the best guess of fleet movement and put their eels into rumps that doctrine had left unguarded. There were numbers in the official report he would later read in a quiet room with a fan. On June 19th, TF-58 launched 902 combat air patrol sorties and shot down 300-plus Japanese aircraft by the count of claims. On June 20th, TF-58 launched 216 strike aircraft late in the day at ranges up to 275 miles, with 20% not returning, nearly half of those due to ditching or night landing. The Japanese lost Taiho, Shokaku, Hyo, and perhaps 426 aircraft, in the broad count to include land-based. The BF battle force under Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee had not had to shoot at anything big because the enemy had not gotten near enough. Their 5-inch/38 had gotten some bites, and the fire control radar's Mark 1222 had done their work when asked. But the story was the sky, and the fighter direction officers made the map of that sky. He knew that there was a thread that ran before and after. He could pull it and find Pearl Harbor a morning when radar's voice was doubted at Opana and believed too late. He could pull it and find Midway the radar at the island, the absence on the carriers, the world saved by navigation and luck. He could pull it and find Guadalcanal, the night battles in Iron Bottom Sound, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal when USS Washington's SG radar and radar fire control turned Kirishima into a story that men still told in bars. He could pull it and find the Philippine Sea and know the line had become straight. He could pull it forward and find Leyte Gulf, Sibuyan Sea, and the sinking of Musashi under waves of aircraft from TG-38. Taffy 3 at Samar, Surigao Strait, and know that the line would stay straight. He could pull it to Okinawa radar picket destroyers like USS Laffey turned into saints and know that the line would be tangled by kamikazes, that radar would be asked to weep and fight at once. Lexington herself wore her war with a particular glamour in the mind. She had been torpedoed in 1943, had been hammered by AAA at Kwajalein, had been a blue sky for the men under her, a blue deck for those above. In TG-583 she had been an instrument, the flattened place where air and sea met. Aaron would touch her painted steel sometimes when the watch was over, just a hand on a bulkhead. Like men touch an animal before going to sleep and feel his heart decelerate enough to allow sleep. He knew her measurements the way he knew his own. 872 feet of flight deck, 27 knots on the screws when she asked nicely, for arresting wires taut like piano strings, 5-inch/38 mounts at the corners, 40mm Bofors peppering the air, 20mm Oerlikons making their fast lace when the sky turned bad. He had seen her list. Barely he wanted to believe never, but he had felt her roll heavy under load and saw how lights reflect on wet deck at night. He had walked from CIC to flag plot and back and felt the ship hum like a patient animal. The night after Mission Beyond Darkness. He stood in the Lexington's open companionway under a sky that had learned to be grateful for lights. He watched the water boil in small ways at the stern, phosphorescence risen by the screws, the wake inviting men to believe in structure. He thought of the YEZB beams that had pulled the strike home like a father's voice across a crowded room. He thought of the order turn on the lights the way other men think of psalms. He thought of 5th Fleet and Task Force 58 and Task Group 583 as if they were neighborhoods in a city he had just learned to inhabit. He thought of Saipan and Tinian and Guam as if they were 3 houses on the same block. He thought of Tahio burning, Shokaka broken, Hio ruined, and he did not feel joyous. He felt the exactness of the work. He remembered the small things that keep men honest. The smell of burnt insulation in a radar set that has run too hot for too long. The grit of a grease pencil that is down to a nub. The untouched end of a cigarette in a pocket that cannot be smoked because the room loves oxygen. The way a Hellcat pilot says Winchester when he has no ammo left. The way an LSO says cut like a mother tells a child to stop. The way a destroyer shows herself sudden under the bow, lit to a soft yellow. Her men on the rail looking up to see if a man will fall into their hands. The way the 5th Fleet's battleships look backwards at the sunset and you can see their turrets cut against sky and imagine a different war with big guns and no air. The way a TBM's propeller wash ripples flags on a catwalk and makes speech a physical thing. Some men in the 5th Fleet staff would write after the battle that Spruance had been too cautious, that Task Force 58 could have driven west, thrown the fast battleships and carriers into a chase, forced Ozawa to ruin in the open. Others said the caution was wisdom. Operation Forager had needed every F-6F Hellcat to be above Saipan and Tinian and Guam in the hours that counted. Aaron could play that game in his head and be on both sides. He could make a map in his mind that showed the arcs of fuel for carriers and battleships, the arcs of CAP coverage for the amphibious ships clustered around Saipan Channel, the arcs of risk for submarines waiting in the long lines east of Luzon and Mindoro. He could put all the arcs on the same sheet and see where they intersected and call it the 5th Fleet's job. He could do the math for time to intercept and time to run and call it fighter direction. He could add one more circle, small, around the place where a VF-16 pilot had told him where he was and then not spoken anymore, and he could call that circle a funeral, and then he would have to stop because he was not made for too much of that. After the battle, the words arranged themselves into phrases ratified by conference rooms. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Operation Forager. 5th Fleet. Task Force 58. Task Group 583. 1st Mobile Fleet. Operation Forager. Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher. Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa. Taiho. Shokaku. Hale. Zuikaku. USS Lexington. USS Enterprise. USS Princeton. USS San Jacinto. VF-16. F-6F Hellcat.
Radar.
Fighter Direction Officer. Combat Information Center. Mission Beyond Darkness. These phrases learned to act like furniture. He would sit on them and eat on them and eventually sleep with his head on them and wake up and still find them useful. When he returned to them later in another war, the one at a desk in a Veterans Administration office, the words would still hold. He would not stop working when the fifth day came because the war did not stop. He would ride USS Lexington CIC outward to Iwo Jima and read Okinawa on the board as the battleships moved their weight forward, and the radar picket destroyers were asked to be saints under oncoming kamikazes. He would vector Hellcats to cut down Yokosuka D-4Y Judas and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars that had been handed base ad hoc as kamikazes because the Philippines had broken Japan's function. He would watch new blips on the SK that did not behave like conventional raids, and Bandit Angels 8 Vector 210 would be lighter in his mouth, because the math was stable and the ethics had to be light or he would fall. He would meet men with burned faces and put their names in the right column in his head and not weep where anyone else could see. In post-war years, he would hear the names again, written by other men's pens. He would read that Admiral Ozawa had carried out Operation Forager as long as his dignity allowed and then had turned away. He would read that Spruance had been criticized and defended for his holdfast. He would read that Mitcher's order to turn on the lights had saved hundreds of aircrew and risked the fleet to submarines that had not been there or had not been placed right. He would read that Hyo had died not only of bombs but of vapors, and that children would grow up to say that carriers are dangerous places and not know what they were referring to, and he would correct them or not. He would read about submarine torpedoes Mark 14s, their pigs under the water, and he would smile blackly because he knew that in the world of the sky you can take nothing for granted, not the reliability of a torpedo, not the scent of a gasoline leak. He would walk one day through a museum where USS Lexington had become a home to children in shorts and older men with ball caps, and he would touch the skin again, this time with so many rivets frozen into a past that felt like present under his hand. He would look at a SK radar antenna installed for show and put his face near it and smell not ozone anymore but carpet cleaner, and he would not be sad because this is what it means to win, that the instruments of killing become toys, that the words Task Force 58 become t-shirts. He would stand under a painting of the Battle of the Philippine Sea and see the F-6F Hellcats of VF-16 in a sky too pretty, and he would smile and not complain, because the painter had to show something, and no one can paint what the SK sees and what the fighter direction officer hears. He would, at night, sometimes listen to the house settle and hear the scopes sweep in the plaster. He would tune his world to it, and his wife would sometimes ask, "Are you listening to the seas again?" And he would say, "No, I am listening to the air." And she would laugh and sleep. He would have sons who would build a plastic F-6F Hellcat and paint it wrong, and he would correct them and then kiss their heads and let the wrong color sit because being right is not always the job. He would take a map down from a shelf and point to Saipan and Tinian in Guam, and to the space where the Fifth Fleet had held against the urge to chase, and he would point to two places to the west where Taiho and Shokaku had gone down, and he would tell the story short because young men like short stories that cut and do not bleed too long. He would remember, always, the voice of VF-16 section leader on Mission Beyond Darkness, the voice thin with altitude and hunger and the word lights in it like prayer, and he would know then that he had been a kind of priest, unordained, with a desk and a scope for an altar. He would say the liturgy again if asked. Task Force 58. Fifth Fleet. Vice Admiral Spruance. Vice Admiral Mitcher. Task Group 583. USS Lexington. USS Enterprise. USS Princeton. USS San Jacinto. VF-16. F-6F Hellcat.
Radar.
Fighter Direction Officer. Combat Information Center. Battle of the Philippine Sea. Marianas Turkey Shoot. Mission Beyond Darkness. First Mobile Fleet. Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa. Taiho. Shokaku. Zuikaku. Hyo. And he would take the meter-long, careful breath of a man who used to pace someone else's lung and say without flourish, because flourish does not belong here. When I saw the first ghost echoes thicken on SK off the Marianas and I began calling vectors from USS Lexington CIC at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, I understood that war had ceased to be a rumor and become a geometry, and that geography had turned into home. He would not call the Japanese enemy without also calling them men. He would remember the voice of AB-6N Jill pilot in his headphones for 5 seconds. The pilot had triggered his transmitter accidentally, or deliberately. A long syllable in a language Aaron had learned at a high school and never thought he would need, something like mother, and he would carry that with him to do the evening dishes in a house 1,000 miles from Saipan. He would say Ozawa's name with respect. He would say Taiho with a sadness reserved for things too serious to be called legends. He would say Shokaku with awe for steel that had carried 1941 into 1944. He would say Zuikaku with the precise memory that she had gotten away, this time, and would die later under a fall of American air at Cape Engano, Leyte Gulf. He would keep these lines straight because his mind worked that way. And in private he would go to a desk and write with a pencil on a card like a grocery list, so that nothing could steal the weight from the words, and arrange them in rows. June 19, 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea Task Force 58 Task Group, 583 USS Lexington. CV-16. Fighter Direction Officer SK Radar VF-16. F-6F Hellcat Operation Forager Saipan Tinian Guam 1st Mobile Fleet Vice Admiral Ozawa Taiho Shokaku Zuikaku A6M50D 4. Y Judy B6N Jill June 22nd? No. June 20th Mission Beyond Darkness Turn on the Lights Return. He would keep the card in a drawer and take it out sometimes and read it out loud and know that this was his way of saying grace. He would sometimes be asked at the edge of a VFW hall what he did in the war, and he would say Fighter Direction Officer on USS Lexington in Task Group 583 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and men would either know what that meant or they would ask. To the ones who knew, he would nod and then be quiet, because there is nothing to be gained by adding adjectives. To the ones who did not, he would say, I watched Japanese raids come in as blips on SK off the Marianas, and I told our F-6F Hellcats where to go. And if they looked blank he would add, we called it the Marianas turkey shoot, but that makes it sound like a party. It wasn't, and he would stop there because beyond that point it becomes literature, and he was a man who had had enough literature at the scope. Sometimes he would dream in angles. He would turn in sleep and his body would be a compass, and he would say Vector 270 Angels 15 Buster with his teeth, and his wife would put her hand on his arm and he would stop and the world would stop swimming. He would go out to the yard in the morning and look southeast and know the direction of the Philippine Sea by how the light lay on his grass. He would read a map of an entirely different place and draw rings on it because that is how men who have had to bring others home in the dark keep themselves honest. He would die one day, like an ordinary man, too old for flyers' rights and too young of heart to be a general. At the service someone would stand up and say words that would not matter.